She was 12 years old. She was walking between her parents' homes on a Sunday evening. It was a route she knew well. Quiet residential streets, familiar neighborhood, less than a mile. She never arrived, and the man who took her off that street walked free for 61 years. This is the story of Mary Teresa Simpson, and it took longer to solve than most people will live. You're watching Old Casebook. On Sunday, March 15th, 1964, in Elmira, New York, a 12-year-old girl left her mother's apartment around 6:30 in the evening. She was heading back to her father's home on foot. The walk was short, a few blocks through the east side of the city. She had walked those streets before. She knew them well. She never made it home. 4 days later, a man hiking with his 2 young sons in the woods off Combs Hill Road found her body buried under rocks, branches, and layers of earth. Her mouth had been stuffed with soil and twigs. She had been strangled. She had been driven out of the city, assaulted, and left on a wooded hillside, concealed beneath stones heavy enough to suggest her killer had spent a significant amount of time making sure she would not be found quickly. It took 61 years to identify him. Mary Teresa Simpson was 12 years old. Her parents, Ellsworth and Rose Simpson, had separated the year before, and Mary Teresa had been living with her father. The two of them had just moved back to Elmira only 2 weeks earlier, returning to the city where Mary Teresa had grown up before her parents' marriage fell apart. On that Sunday, March 15th, she left her father's apartment around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, telling him she was going to visit her cousin. Instead, she went to see her mother. The visit was unannounced, but Rose was happy to see her. They spent the afternoon together, catching up after months of limited contact. Around 6:30 that evening, Mary Teresa said goodbye and headed back toward her father's apartment. Alone, on foot, she never arrived. Ellsworth waited through the evening. When it got late and Mary Teresa still wasn't home, he started making calls. Rose, relatives, anyone he could think of who might know where she was. Nobody had seen her after she left her mother's door. Nobody remembered seeing her walking on the street that evening. Ellsworth contacted Elmira police that night. Mary Teresa Simpson was officially reported missing. Elmira, in 1964, was a city of about 40,000 people, built along the Chemung River, neighborhoods of wood frame houses spreading outward from the downtown core. The walk between Rose's home and Ellsworth's apartment ran through quiet residential streets on the east side. Mary Teresa had known these streets her whole life, but March in upstate New York means short days. By 6:30 in the evening, the light was already fading. The sidewalks were mostly empty, most families already inside for dinner. Mary Teresa was 12 years old, walking alone in the last hour of daylight on a Sunday evening. Somewhere along that walk, someone encountered her. For 4 days, police and volunteers searched every block between her mother's home and her father's apartment. Officers knocked on doors, checked basements and garages, stopped anyone who had been outside that Sunday evening. Volunteers spread along both banks of the Chemung River and into the parks and empty lots on the outskirts of the city. Search parties walked the wooded hillsides and logging roads surrounding Elmira, hilly, heavily forested terrain with patches of snow and ice still on the ground from winter. Ellsworth waited at home for the phone to ring. Rose waited. Her older sister Linda, who was 16 at the time, waited alongside them. On the 4th day, the call came. A man hiking with his 2 young sons found her on a wooded hillside off Combs Hill Road, roughly 5 miles southwest of downtown Elmira. She had been buried beneath heavy stones, tree branches, and layers of leaves and earth. The weight of the stones alone told investigators that her killer had spent a significant amount of time at that site. This was not a panicked disposal. This was deliberate concealment. The autopsy confirmed sexual assault. The cause of death, asphyxiation by strangulation. Someone had taken Mary Teresa Simpson off a residential street, driven her out of the city, and left her on a hillside above the town where she had grown up. Elmira police shifted immediately from a missing persons case to a full homicide investigation. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been in the area on the evening of March 15th. Men who lived along the roads leading to the hillside. Men seen driving in the area that Sunday. Men with prior arrests involving children. Criminal records were pulled at local, state, and federal level. Every known offender in the region was checked. Tips came in from across Chemung County. Witness statements were cross-referenced against every name in the growing file. Police interviewed more than 300 people in the months that followed. Not one of them could tell investigators who had taken Mary Teresa off that street. In 1964, the science needed to read the biological material recovered from her clothing simply did not exist. The evidence was there, collected, preserved, but unreadable. The case went cold, and for 61 years, Mary Teresa Simpson's killer lived free. By October of 1964, 7 months after the murder, detectives had questioned more than 300 people. The effort was unlike anything the Elmira Police Department had ever undertaken. Officers worked the case around the clock for months. Nothing. No viable suspect. No meaningful lead. The local radio station and the Star-Gazette newspaper raised a $1,000 reward for information. The community contributed what it could. Residents who had never met Mary Teresa donated money. The murder had shaken Elmira in a way nothing else had in recent memory. By 1972, the reward had been increased to $5,000. In the 6 decades that followed, nobody ever collected it. The case generated thousands of pages of documentation, interviews, tips, leads, all logged, all filed, all filling entire cabinets in the department's records room. As years passed and detectives retired, new officers inherited the file. They read through the stacks of reports, searching for a name or a connection that previous investigators had missed. Every review reached the same conclusion. Every actionable lead had dried up decades ago. The case became the most well-known unsolved crime in the history of the Elmira Police Department. Every detective who came through the department knew about it. 61 years of institutional memory passed from one generation of officers to the next. The file had outlasted them all, and still, no name attached to the crime. Her killer was never questioned. His name did not appear anywhere in the file. He had no known connection to Mary Teresa, to her parents, or to anyone in her family. Investigators who reviewed the case decades later concluded that the crime was most likely an act of opportunity. A stranger, a Sunday evening, a 12-year-old girl walking alone. But the person who carried the weight of this case the longest was not a detective. It was a sister. Linda Simpson was 4 years older than Mary Teresa. She was 16 in March of 1964. The two sisters had been apart for nearly a year while Mary Teresa lived with their father in another town. The move back to Elmira had brought them closer again. Mary Teresa had only been back for 2 weeks when she was killed. Linda watched the investigation unfold and then stall. The years passed. The detectives who had originally worked the case moved on. Local newspapers stopped covering it. The rewards sat uncollected, but the case never faded from Linda. She watched her parents age and die without ever learning who had killed their youngest daughter. Ellsworth died first. Rose died later. Neither of them lived long enough to hear the name of the man who had taken Mary Teresa off that street. It affected me really badly, Linda said later. I lived through it for years and cried and suffered heartache all this time. Like I told everybody, I did this for my mom. Linda kept calling the Elmira Police Department, sometimes once a year, sometimes more often. Always the same question, always the same answer. Nothing new. In the year 2000, 36 years after the murder, Mary Teresa's clothing was submitted to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center for analysis. The items had been collected at autopsy in 1964 and stored in evidence ever since. The technology to analyze biological material at this level had not existed when the crime was committed. Analysts examined the blouse first. They found biological material and were able to develop a male DNA profile from it. The profile was clear enough to be used for comparison if a suspect could ever be identified. They entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's national database that stores genetic profiles from convicted offenders and compares them against evidence from unsolved cases. If the man who killed Mary Teresa had ever been convicted of a qualifying offense anywhere in the country, the system would have flagged a match automatically. It came back empty. 3 years later, in 2003, additional clothing was submitted for further analysis. Analysts examined her skirt and underwear and recovered more biological material. The additional samples confirmed the original profile and strengthened it with more genetic data, but without a match in CODIS or any other law enforcement database. The identity of the man who left that DNA on her clothing remained unknown. Then came a detail that made everything worse. The man who left that DNA on her clothing in 1964 died 1 year after the 2003 testing, he was buried in an Elmira cemetery, less than 5 miles from the wooded hillside where he had left her body 4 decades earlier. His DNA had never been collected. He had never been a suspect. Nobody had any reason to ask for it. He had died and taken his secret with him, or so it seemed. In 2022, the Elmira Police Department applied for and received funding through Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that provides grants to law enforcement agencies for advanced forensic testing in cold cases. The grant covered the full cost of submitting the DNA evidence to a private laboratory. The DNA was sent to Othram, a private forensic genetics lab in the Woodlands, Texas, specializing in building profiles from degraded biological material. The samples from the Simpson case were nearly 60 years old at that point, stored under varying conditions since 1964. If anyone could read them, it was Othram. Othram scientists applied a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, extracting whatever genetic information remained in material that was more than half a century old. From those degraded samples, they built a full and usable genetic profile of the unknown male. That profile was then uploaded to public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases where millions of Americans have voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace their ancestry. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team began searching for relatives of the unknown person through those databases. In 2023, investigators also partnered with the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College, where criminologist Dr. Christina Lane and her students assisted with the genealogical research, tracing family lines, cross-referencing public records with genetic data, working methodically through every branch of the suspect's family tree. The work was slow. The crime was from 1964. The suspect's family tree stretched back generations into upstate New York. Birth records from that era were incomplete. Marriage records had gaps. Some branches were nearly impossible to follow, but they kept going, generation by generation. The list narrowed. The FBI team managed the genetic comparisons. The students handled the records research. Together, they worked outward from the DNA matches, identifying living descendants, eliminating branches, closing in. By 2025, after more than 2 years of genealogical work, the tree had narrowed to a single individual. He had lived in Elmira in 1964. He was 32 years old at the time of the murder, a truck driver, a Korean War veteran, married with children. He had spent his entire life in the same city where the crime took place, and he had been dead since March of 2004. Investigators contacted his surviving son and requested a voluntary DNA sample. The comparison confirmed a parent-child genetic relationship between the son and the unknown male whose DNA had been found on Mary Teresa's clothing decades earlier. But investigators wanted more than a familial match. A familial match identifies a family line, not a specific individual within that line. They obtained authorization to exhume the suspect's body from the cemetery where he had been buried for more than 20 years. The remains were carefully recovered, documented, and transported to the state forensic laboratory. DNA extracted directly from the exhumed remains was compared against the male profile recovered from Mary Teresa's clothing in 2000 and confirmed in 2003. The match was definitive. No ambiguity, no room for doubt. The odds of selecting an unrelated individual who would produce the same profile, less than 1 in 320 billion. After 61 years of searching and waiting, the unknown male finally had a name. His name was Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. Born in 1931, Murray grew up in Elmira and never left. He served in the United States Army during the Korean War and came home to marry a woman named Rosemary. Together, they had 4 children. He spent much of his adult life working as a truck driver. The roads in and around the city were part of his daily routine. He knew the back roads, the wooded areas, the logging trails, the stretches of hillside outside of town. He was also known to local police for past behavior involving children. The department had records on him going back years, and yet the investigators who spent months working the case in 1964 never came across his name. He was never interviewed, never fingerprinted, never questioned. He lived the next 40 years in Elmira without ever being identified. He drove the same roads, shopped at the same stores, attended family gatherings and community events. From the outside, nothing about his life raised suspicion. Nobody in Elmira ever connected him to the death of Mary Teresa Simpson. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. died on March 16, 2004. He was 73 years old. His obituary was published in the Star Gazette on March 19, 2004. March 19th, the same date Mary Teresa's body had been found on Combs Hill Road, exactly 40 years earlier. The obituary listed his wife, Rosemary, his surviving children, his grandchildren, and his military service. It described a man who had lived his whole life in one city, served his country, and raised a family. It did not mention Mary Teresa Simpson. At the time of his death, the two names had never been connected. The crime was entirely opportunistic. Murray had no personal connection to the Simpson family. No shared workplace, no mutual acquaintance, no prior relationship of any kind. A 32-year-old truck driver with a vehicle and a history of predatory behavior saw a 12-year-old girl walking alone on a March evening and took her. On February 10th, 2026, the Elmira Police Department, the Chemung County District Attorney's Office, and the FBI held a joint press conference. Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood at the podium. "This is a historic day for the Elmira Police Department," she said. If Murray was still alive, the District Attorney's Office would seek criminal charges against him for murder. Several of Mary Teresa's surviving family members were in the room. Linda was there. She was in her 70s now, retired, a grandmother herself. She had spent the past 6 decades carrying the weight of a Sunday evening in March 1964, a weight that was never fully hers to carry and yet never left her. "I'm very happy it's finally ended," Linda said. "I just wish my mom was here." She had waited more than 61 years for someone to stand at a podium and say a name out loud. "I hope the family members here know this case was never forgotten," Chief Thorne said. Mary Teresa was never forgotten. From the crime to the identification, the case had spanned 61 years and the entire history of forensic DNA science. A 12-year-old girl found under a pile of rocks and branches on a wooded hillside, found by a man and his 2 sons on a Thursday morning in March of 1964. The man who put her there lived in the same city for another 40 years and died without anyone ever asking him about it. It took 61 years, a non-profit grant, a private genetics lab in Texas, a college professor and her students, and the voluntary DNA of a son who had no idea what his father had done to find his name. Mary Teresa Simpson was not a case number. She was a daughter, a sister, a kid in a small city in upstate New York who had been through a difficult year and was simply trying to get home. She deserved better than what happened to her on that Sunday evening, and she deserved to have his name spoken out loud. Now it has been. Thank you for watching Old Casebook. If this case stayed with you, leave a comment below. Subscribe for a new true crime documentary every week. Every name in these stories belonged to a real person. Mary Teresa Simpson deserves to be remembered.